Today we're going to talk about jazz. Grab your real book and join me at the Prog School. This lesson is going to touch on one element of jazz in particular, and that's form or structure. I've talked a little bit about form in the past, but I wanted to do a deep dive on one specific form, and that's the 32-bar jazz form, or the AABA form. Bringing elements of different styles of music into prog is one of my favorite things about writing progressive music. And usually this is done harmonically or rhythmically, borrowing a swing rhythm from jazz, or a classical harmony, or doing a country hoedown. And these are all really cool, but I think borrowing form or structure from another style of music is an often overlooked way of bringing the sound of that style into your own music. I'm going to talk in depth about the 32-bar form today, its history, how it's built, and some common additions and alterations to it. I took this form and used it as the basis for a really modern progressive metal piece. And while it doesn't really sound that much like jazz, the influence of the 32-bar form made for a piece of music that went a lot of places I wouldn't normally go. And hopefully this can inspire you to explore some different forms when you're writing your own music. The 32-bar form found its popularity in the early 20th century in Tin Pan Alley songs and American popular music. Tin Pan Alley was the nickname of 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue in Manhattan. Between 1895 and 1930, a majority of music publishers were in this district and were responsible for the flourishing of the American popular song during that time. Many popular songs and show tunes with a 32-bar form became jazz standards that all jazz musicians study. They're great vehicles for improvisation. The 32-bar form is split into 4 sections, or AABA, with each section being 8 measures long. The first A section introduces the primary melody and chords. The second A section repeats the melody and chords from the first A section, often with different lyrics if there are vocals, and sometimes with a slightly different ending. The B section is where the form goes somewhere completely different, a new melody, different chords, and often a different key. Then it's back to the A section again, bringing back the primary melody and chords, usually building to a transition back to the top of the form. In a jazz standard, this 32-bar form will repeat throughout the entirety of the song. A really basic order might look something like this. In the first 32 bars, the main melody will be played, and this is also called the head of the tune. Then it's into the solos. During the solos, each repeat of the 32-bar form is called a chorus. This is open-ended, so each musician can improvise as many choruses as they'd like to. For example, 4 choruses of a sax solo, then 4 choruses of a trumpet solo, and then 5 choruses of a piano solo. After the solos, the head, or melody, will come back to play the tune out. When I went to write this tune, I wanted to stay pretty strictly within this 32-bar form. That allowed me to explore some different sounds and writing techniques within the form. There are some pretty common variations and additions to this 32-bar form, and I decided to try to get as many of those into my tune as I could as well. Here's a more complex structure for a 32-bar jazz standard. Often there'll be an introduction before the melody starts. This could be an improvisation or a planned figure that all the musicians play that leads into the head of the tune. Alternately, you might have a vamp at the beginning that acts as a springboard to the main tune. A vamp usually consists of a single chord or a sequence of chords played in a repeated rhythm. It sets up the groove and harmonic content for the tune. An introduction, vamp, or sometimes both will lead into the head of the tune. One common variation within the 32-bar form is for the second A section to be a modulated version of the first A section. In the tune All the Things You Are, for example, the first A section is in F minor, and the second A section has the same melody and chords, but in C minor. At the end of the head going into the solos, there will often be a break, usually 1 or 2 measures long, to let the first soloist lead into their solo. Another common addition to this structure is trading fours. Trading fours is essentially a broken up drum solo that happens after all the other soloists have played. 4-measure sections are alternately played by a soloist from the band and the drummer playing unaccompanied for 4 measures. For example, you could have 4 measures guitar solo, 4 measures drum solo, and then 4 measures saxophone, and then 4 measures drum solo. And this will continue for the entirety of the 32-bar form for as many choruses as necessary. One more common addition to this structure is the shout chorus. In jazz, a shout chorus is usually the last chorus of a big band arrangement, and it's characterized by being the most energetic, lively, and exciting of the sections, and it often contains the strongest musical climax. The addition of a vamp, like I mentioned earlier, can also happen between any of the solos and at the end of the solos. Then it's back into the head of the tune. If there was an introduction in the tune, that will often play again at the end as an outro. I managed to add all of these additions into my 32-bar form piece. The structure of my tune goes like this: introduction, vamp, head with a solo break into a guitar solo, then trading chords with the drums, a shout chorus, back to the vamp, back to the head, and then to the outro, which is the same as the intro. Now that I've spent way too much time talking about this form, let's take a look at how I turn this into some modern progressive metal. Without straying from this form, I wanted to do a couple things to mess with it and also obscure it a little bit. The main ways I chose to do this were rhythmically, harmonically, specifically the harmonic rhythm, and dynamically. The easiest way to obscure this form is to change the time signature, and I'm using a 13/8 pattern in the A sections. It's grouped as 2 quarter notes and 3 dotted quarter notes. An 8-measure A section that's in 13/8 doesn't have the natural resolving feeling of an 8-bar section in 4/4, which is what the majority of jazz standards are in. This rhythm happens in the hand clapping, in the vamp, and in the head. The rhythm guitars, bass, and kick also play variations on this rhythm throughout the tune, adding some extra eighth notes here and there. Here are a couple examples of that. The first one here is from the end of the guitar solo. And the second one is from the first A section of the head. This 13/8 is further complicated in the first and last A sections of the head by having a bar of 14/8 and 16/8. The main reason behind this was I liked the way it flowed into the next sections better with these few extra beats. When in doubt, you gotta do what sounds best to you. The tempo of this tune also makes this rhythm more complex. I have it written as half note equals 125 beats per minute, which is the equivalent of quarter notes equaling 250 beats per minute. This is a super fast tempo, and part of the reason I did this was because a lot of jazz standards are played very quickly. Many of the most famous jazz standards were popularized in the bebop era of jazz, where the tunes ended up in the 200 to even 400 BPM range. It was a way for jazz musicians of the time to push the music to the extreme, and I wanted to call back to that a little bit. When jazz tunes get really fast, most musicians will feel them with a half-note pulse, hence why they are often written in cut time, and why I chose to have the half note be the pulse. All this to say that these quarter notes and dotted quarter notes in the 13/8 rhythm fly by pretty quickly. Maybe the trickiest thing about this 13/8 rhythm is that it usually is happening over a half note pulse or override in the cymbals. You can check out my last Prog School lesson if you want to learn all about overrides. You can see this very clearly in the first A section of the guitar solo. The hi-hat plays a half note pulse while the kick and snare do a slight variation on this 13/8 rhythm. It takes 4 measures for the hi-hat to line back up with the beginning of the measure, giving it a polyrhythmic feel. This polyrhythmic feeling is further exploited by the snare placement. During the first head, the snare is hitting with the 13/8 rhythm, but in the solo it's providing a backbeat by hitting with the hi-hat. Later on in the tune, I jump back and forth between these two snare placements for the sake of variety. This is really complex stuff rhythmically, but the idea was to take away the feeling of clearly resolved 8-bar phrases. By doing that, I'm able to work within this 32-bar form and keep it from sounding too straightforward, because this is prog after all. Now let's look at the rhythm for the B section. Remember, the B section needs to be something very different from the A sections, and I did that with the chords and melody, but I also did it with the rhythm. I wanted to get away from the polyrhythmic feel here and do something a little more straightforward, and I chose to put this in 6/4. 6/4 has one less eighth note than 13/8, so it seemed like a good rhythm that would be more straightforward, but not too far removed from the A sections. The speed of the quarter notes here gives the B section a heavy triplet 6/8 feel, and I'm a big fan of 6/8 or 12/8 grooves for added heaviness. I do some really weird rhythmic stuff with the 6/4 later on, but the main idea of having a completely different feel for these B sections continues throughout the whole tune. Completely changing up the groove for the B section is my homage to Latin jazz, where A sections and B sections will alternate between a swing feel and a Latin feel. A Night in Tunisia, for example, has an Afro-Cuban groove in the A sections and then a swing groove in the B sections. Now let's take a look at some of the things I did harmonically to mess with this form. First thing I did was to focus on chordal chords in the A section. Chordal chords are chords built on fourths instead of thirds, like your traditional triads. These have a very modern jazz and fusion feel, as well as some modern classical music. And this kept it from sounding like traditional jazz standard chord progressions, which usually use a lot of 2/5s and more functional harmony. Here are the chords for the first A section. Notice most of these are based on stacks of fourth intervals, save for the A flat major 9, sharp 11. Another way I'm keeping this from sounding like traditional jazz is the resolutions, as there are no traditional 5-to-1 resolutions here. Instead, I'm using a lot of chromatic movement in the bass notes. Notice the D to E flat, A to B flat, and the G to A flat. These make for pretty natural chord movements while staying away from those common resolutions. Maybe the biggest way I'm messing with the harmony is rhythmically. Usually in a jazz standard, chords will change on the downbeat of measures, or sometimes on beat 3 if there's 2 chords per bar. Notice there's 8 different chords here, which I could have done as 1 chord per measure, like this. Instead, I change up the harmonic rhythm, or the rhythm of where the chords change, by putting the chord changes in different parts of this 13/8 rhythm, sometimes completely missing the downbeat. This adds to the obscuring of the 8-bar phrase, because chord changes often inform where a new measure will begin. When it gets to the B section, the chords change on the downbeat of every measure, adding to the different feel between the A and B sections. Here's a lead sheet I've made for this tune. A lead sheet is the most common way to write out a jazz standard. It just has the melody, rhythm, and chords. Here's a lead sheet for the head, and here's the lead sheet for the solo. The solo lead sheet gives a little clearer picture of where the chords change. The last major way I mess with the form is dynamically, and I'll go over that as I go through the whole tune. The introduction starts the tune off with a bang, and it uses the 13/8 rhythm from the A sections, as well as chords from the first and second A sections. Then it comes way down for the vamp. This puts the 13/8 rhythm in the hand claps, and I was heavily inspired by the Pat Metheny group tune, The First Circle, when it came to these hand claps. Pat Metheny is one of my favorite jazz musicians. Then it moves into the head. Here I keep the volume down until halfway through the second A section. Usually the head would be played at a more even dynamic level, but adding some dynamic contrast in here helped to change it up a bit. At the end of the head, there's a short 4-quarter note break for the guitar to lead into its solo. The solo lasts one time through the form, or one chorus, and once again I bring the dynamics down here. The rhythm guitars hold off coming in until the B section. And this is meant to be reminiscent of when jazz players improvise, where the beginning of their solos will come down and then build up in intensity. I'll make a separate video on the solo because I think there's some cool guitar ideas in there that I won't be able to get to in this video. After the solo, it moves to one chorus of trading fours. Instead of trading soloists and the drums like you might normally hear, I decided to trade these nodey guitar riffs with the drum solos. This was a nice way to introduce a metal riff-based section and still roughly follow what a jazz tune would do. This part is pretty wild. It's 4 measures of these trading runs between the left and right rhythm guitar, and then 4 measures of really over-the-top drum fills. Here in the trading fours is where I make an adjustment rhythmically to the B section. It stays in 6/4, but what I do is put 7 notes in the place of where you'd normally have 6 eighth notes, making a 7 against 6 tuplet. I've been experimenting with different tuplet ideas lately, and this one worked out pretty naturally, and it doesn't sound quite as crazy as it looks. Since the beat here is really felt as dotted half notes, or 3/4 notes, this kind of feels like a 7/8 rhythm inside that amount of time. And this was born out of experimentation and ended up being pretty cool, and I use this idea again in the head at the end of the tune. As always, I recommend experimenting with new things you are learning. You never know when you might end up with something good. From the trading fours, it moves into the shout chorus. Here I simplify the rhythm for the entirety of the 32-bar form and put it all in 12/8. I wanted to make it simpler here because of all the craziness that's happened before. It's nice to give the listener a break every once in a while. The chords change in simpler places here. I bring the dynamics way down and introduce these building string figures. Usually a shout chorus would be really loud with extra orchestration. I opted to bring it down in intensity, just for something a little bit different, but I did add the extra orchestration, specifically with these strings. There's variations of the main melody throughout the shout chorus, and I build it up by getting super loud in the last A section here. This is kind of the climax of the whole piece, which is pretty common for a shout chorus. Then it comes right back down again into the vamp, leading into the head one more time. These big dynamic shifts help to hide the form a bit as well. Typically you wouldn't hear as many of these dramatic dynamic shifts in a jazz standard. The head at the end of the tune here is loud throughout, differentiating it from the first head that was played. As I mentioned earlier, here in the B section, the 7/6 tuplet returns. The last A section here really builds up into the end of the tune. The snare and cymbals pound out half notes, and there's also an arpeggio figure in the strings and electric piano that's similar to one that happened during the last A section of the shout chorus. I tried to have the head at the end here bring back some elements from earlier in the tune. Then it's back to the introduction again, and the hand claps return with the 13/8 rhythm and fade out into the end. Hope you all enjoyed this lesson. I tried my best to be clear on how I approach the form here, but this one is particularly complex. So if you have any questions, send them my way or jump on one of my live streams and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Breaking outside of forms and structures that you normally use can make for something really different and interesting, and I had a blast writing this tune. If you feel inspired to do something similar, please share it with me. I'd love to check it out. As always, I'll let the full tune play out at the end of the video. In the video, the different sections of the tune will be labeled so you can follow along with the form as it happens. You can follow the link in the description below to pick this up on my Bandcamp if you want to support me more directly. But the full song will be here on YouTube as well as all of your major streaming services. If you enjoyed this lesson, like, subscribe, hit the bell notification, give it a share. Until next time, stay proggy.